So before we get started, I just wanted to hit on just a sort of a logistical challenge with this, because most of the programs that I do, we're looking at two-dimensional images. And I think that there is an inherent challenge in looking at three-dimensional architectural space and understanding that when we're looking at that in two dimensions. If you've ever shopped for real estate online, you know that right off the bat. So I'm going to try to be really clear about what we're looking at, when we're looking at it. And certainly during these pauses, when I ask if anybody has any questions, if you need me to sort of back up and make something a little bit more clear, I'm happy to do that. So like I said, this is a really personal subject for me because more than 20 years ago, when I was in college, I interned at the Zimmerman house. I helped to archive some of the materials that belonged to the Zimmermans. And then in 2009, I began leading the tour program there, which meant I was training the new docents and also the seasoned docents, the tour guides there. And so we were talking about the art, the architecture, the landscape of this incredible building that's up here in New Hampshire. And because they were so dedicated, they sort of inspired a dedication in me. And because of that, I've visited probably more than 36 Frank Lloyd Wright houses or sites, some of them private, some of them public. But the great thing about going back to a site like the Zimmerman house again and again is that your perspective changes as you grow older and you notice new things and you appreciate new things. And so you change and the house changes along with you. So that's a long preamble. So let's get into what we're really here to talk about, which is Frank Lloyd Wright, this gorgeous house that we have up on the screen here, which is, of course, his iconic building, Falling Water. We're going to talk a little bit about who Frank Lloyd Wright is, but he had a very long life and a remarkable career. So we're sort of skimming the surface, but I wanted to give you a good sense of who he is or who he was. And I think a lot of people have sort of an idea here. So just a thumbnail sketch, a very broad introduction. Frank Lloyd Wright, the little baby we see on the left here, he was born just after the Civil War in 1867. And he lived to the ripe old age of 91. So he died in 1959, really in the space age. So to go from the Civil War to the space age is a pretty remarkable lifespan right there. He had an incredibly long and an incredibly productive career. And so he was creating buildings that even today look very distinctly modern. He was an architect, he was a furniture designer, a landscape designer, an author, a teacher. He was doing all sorts of different things and doing them very well, very effectively. There are probably about 1,100 building designs that are ascribed to him, also probably produced by some of his architectural students too. And over 500 of those designs were realized, they were actually built. Frank Lloyd Wright himself had a really dramatic life story. He had humble beginnings, he faced many obstacles, he had tremendous successes, he even had a classic fall from grace, and then skyrocketing success after that. So in many ways, it's like the classic American story. And he has been awarded with all sorts of accolades over the years. He was voted the greatest American architect of all time. So I think when we think architect as Americans, we think of him. And he's really sort of captured the popular imagination. No offense to his body of work, but I think that part of this is personality driven. Frank Lloyd Wright was the type of person who wore capes, berets. He would say things like, I feel a strange disease coming on, and it's called humility. So here we see him in two sort of iconic ways or markers of success from the 20th century. The first is being on the cover of Time magazine, and this is from 1938, and then also being featured on a postage stamp, which is from 1966, so almost about 30 years between these two. And you see behind him in both of these images iconic buildings that we're going to look at a little bit more in depth today. So Falling Water on the Time magazine there, and the Guggenheim Museum in New York City on the right. So just to give you the lay of the land, how we're going to move through this material, I'm going to start off just giving us a little bit of context, talking about his early career and how he got started in Chicago. Then we'll look at some of those masterworks, specifically Falling Water and the Guggenheim Museum. there's so many buildings. It's so hard to choose what to touch on when we're thinking about somebody who was so prolific. Then I'll talk a little bit about how he has these different styles of homes. And I just want to hit home right now the idea that the fact that he came up with different house types like this, successful house types that have this kind of enduring appeal to them, even that right there is remarkable. I think if you're an architect and you're able to come up with one house type, that would be something really amazing. But over this long career, he was able to continually innovate. We'll talk about the Zimmerman House in Manchester, New Hampshire, which many of you have probably seen or been to, and then also touch on the Colombian House, which is just down the street and was just recently acquired by the Currier Museum of Art. And then we'll wrap up with what Wright's legacy looks like today. All right, so all of that in about an hour. Okay, so to get started, a little bit of context here. What we're looking at is a Currier and Ives print from 1871. And you can probably tell what we're going to talk about right here, a big, gigantic fire, the Great Fire of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. We see people fleeing the city in carriages and on foot. Essentially, there was this massive fire, destroyed about 3 square miles of space in downtown Chicago. It was mostly wooden structures at the time. And it literally left a void in this city that looked something like this. This is a photograph from just after the fire that created a brand new need for architects in the Midwest. And Frank Lloyd Wright grew up in Wisconsin and went to college in Wisconsin, but he was quickly drawn to Chicago as a young man. So basically all of this new available real estate attracts a number of ambitious and innovative architects to the city. And that's really why Chicago is sort of thought of as the birthplace of the skyscraper. And so actually what's regarded as the world's first skyscraper was built there in 1885. It's actually no longer there today. The other significant event from the late 19th century, and I'm sure all the readers who are with us tonight know exactly what this is about, was the World's Colombian Exhibition, or the World's Fair, from 1893. And we're looking at what we would call the fairgrounds, essentially, from that incredible event. And it was, as you can see here, it was a neoclassical city that was built in Chicago to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival to the New World. So there were about 27 million people that visited the World's Fair. This was a huge event, and it only ran for about 6 months. So it was just on a grand scale, and it included this kind of grandeur that really exceeded anything that had come before it. So it was just this kind of symbol of what America was really capable of. Here's just another view of what the World's Colombian Exhibition looked like. This is sort of a favorite pet topic for many, many art historians, because the entire event was a major architectural and engineering undertaking. I'm sure many of you have probably read Devil in the White City, which touches upon all these architects sort of coming together. Some of the world's best architects, certainly America's best architects at the time, and they designed these 14 great buildings that were just these temporary structures. So like I said, this was a major undertaking. It was 690 acres of space that was covered in all of these buildings, about 200 buildings. And obviously things like canals and lagoons and that sort of thing. And then these little pockets or these sort of relegated areas that were supposed to kind of look at other cultures too, being that it was a World's Fair. And so this World's Colombian Exhibition from 1893 did have this enormous impact of bringing together these great minds and featuring all this architecture. And most of it was kind of passé. Well, you wouldn't think it would be the kind of architecture that would inspire a modernist like Frank Lloyd Wright. But he did go, of course, and the buildings that really resonated with him are, first, the one on the left, which was designed by his mentor, Louis Sullivan. It was the Transportation Building. And I just want you to sort of keep in your mind here that right off the bat, this doesn't look like those other neoclassical structures. We've got this kind of rounded Roman arched doorway, and then this kind of flat roof here. And this is something that really resonates with Wright, and we'll see it sort of bubble up again in some of his earlier designs. There was also the Japanese pavilion at the World's Colombian exhibition. And as far as we know, that was Wright's real first engagement with Japanese architecture, which would have a real impact on the rest of his career, even if he wouldn't credit it with having that kind of impact. So that same year of the World's Colombian exhibition, Frank Lloyd Wright opens his own studio. He had, like I said, he had been apprenticing with other architects in Chicago. So this is his home and studio in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park that was built in 1898. And he and his first wife, Catherine, raised 6 children there. So this was really a bustling place. It was his studio. He had many apprentices himself that were sort of going in and out. He spent the first 20 years of his 70-year career in Oak Park. If you've never been there before, Frank Lloyd Wright is a great reason to visit. There's about 25 buildings and houses right in this sort of beautiful suburban town that were designed by him. So, and because it's sort of the early part of his career, you can see where a lot of ideas were kind of taking root. So we're gonna go inside this building and check out a few spaces that I think sort of speak to his philosophies and what he was really interested in doing. And the first space inside of his home and studio, this one here, it's called the Children's Playroom. And just to get you oriented here, both of these images are of the same space, and you're just looking in different directions, essentially. So at one end of the room, there's a fireplace, and at the other end, you can see that there's the piano and this arched doorway here. So this gives you, probably right off the bat, you're thinking of Louis Sullivan and that transportation building and that rounded Roman arch that we saw before. So we've got this kind of barrel vaulted arch ceiling, which is gorgeous in and of itself. This is, you know, when I think of children's playrooms, I think of a rumpus room in the basement, right? And I think any one of us would love to live out the rest of our lives in this room here. There's just a warmth to it, right? The colors are like these natural wood colors. And then there's this kind of elegance to it too, with that rounded ceiling. There are stained glass windows, and obviously, you know, a piano in here as well. So there's a really beautiful quality to it, and there's this warmth quality to it too. I want to kind of zoom in. Oh, I should mention just a couple of wonderful innovations here. Frank Lloyd Wright loved music. He wanted the piano in this room, but he didn't want it to take up too much space. So he actually sort of built it into the wall, and it actually goes out over the staircase as you're walking up to this room. We're gonna zoom in over here. You can see that there's a mural over the fireplace here. It's a depiction of a scene from Arabian Nights, which was one of Wright's favorite stories when he was a child. It was painted by one of his friends. You can see here that he's using these kind of long, skinny bricks around this room, and he does love to use that style of brick sort of throughout his career too. One of the things that makes this room, I think, so appealing is the way these windows on the sides are sort of pushed out. So we love to think about, you know, sitting down in a window like that and reading a book, but it's actually, it's designed on the scale of a child. And it's designed to make you feel almost as though you're in a treehouse. So there's something just really magical here where he's really understanding the people that were going to be using this room and how to make this room particularly special for them. So a couple of these ideas sort of bleed out through the rest of the house. This is a fireplace nook that he created on the main floor of the house here. And fireplaces are always important to Frank Lloyd Wright in his designs. Again, we see that rounded Roman arch. Frank Lloyd Wright he's a highly quotable individual. He's like a Mark Twain, but without all the racism. So we have truth is life here. We have good friend around these hearthstones. Speak no evil word of any creature. So Frank Lloyd Wright was always kind of putting out big ideas like this. And oftentimes his clients, and we'll see the Zimmermans in particular, just ate it up. So we've got, again, these kind of colors from nature, these kind of grand spaces, intimate spaces, but no one ever accused Frank Lloyd Wright of creating comfortable furniture. So this is the dining rooms from that same house. And we can see how these very straight back, high back chairs that he created give this room sort of the sense of a room within a room. It creates this sense of privacy, this sense of intimacy. But again, nobody's dying to eat dinner in one of those chairs, right? But we also get a sense in a room like this, a real sort of sophisticated understanding of the way that the experience of light can shape your experience of a room too. So Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio is such a great lesson in how sensitive he is to kind of the lived experience of the interior of these spaces. So over the next few years, again, this is as Frank Lloyd Wright is experiencing all this tumult in his personal life. In 1909, he leaves his wife and runs off with the wife of one of his clients. And the scandal eventually brings them back to Wisconsin, where he was from originally. And we see here on the left an image of his home in Wisconsin that's called Taliesin. And so he was living there, and as he's dealing with the economic crisis of the Great Depression in the 1930s, he comes up with a lot of different ideas in terms of how they can continue to survive. He was sort of known as a rich man's architect. And so what do you do to keep building and designing? One of the things he does is he creates a school of architecture called the Taliesin Fellowship. So we see him here surrounded by all of these earnest looking young men who are really interested in his design philosophy. I want you to keep that picture of him surrounded by his students in your head, because it plays into the story of Falling Water so wonderfully. So here we have one of the most iconic structures in all of America, right? Everybody looks at this and we immediately know that it's Frank Lloyd Wright and that it's Falling Water. So this was designed in 1935. I'm sure a few of you have probably been there. It's sort of a pilgrimage for a lot of people. It's located in southwestern Pennsylvania, about 45 minutes outside of Pittsburgh. And it's something we should all do before we die. I think it's an incredible, incredible spot. So it was designed for Edgar Kaufman. He owned a department store in Pittsburgh, and he and his family had a little cabin out in the woods that was near this waterfall that they so loved. So he asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design sort of a more permanent weekend home for them. And here's just another view, essentially from the same spot, but it gives us a good sense of the change of seasons here. So this building has been called Wright's Most Beautiful Job by Time Magazine. It's listed among Smithsonian's life list of 28 places to see before you die. It's a designated National Historic Landmark. And in 1991, the members of the American Institute of Architects named Falling Water the best all-time work of American architecture. So, I mean, there's awards after awards after awards. But there's a great story too in terms of how it came to be, because Kaufman had given Wright the job of designing this house, and he really didn't hear anything from Wright for about 9 months. And then one day he called him up and he said, "I'm on my way to your studio. I'll be there in about 2 hours." And supposedly Wright, gathered around all of his students. And in the space of those 2 hours, he designed this incredible, iconic structure. And he referred to it, the language here you just love, he shook it out of his sleeve. So it's just so wonderful to think that something like this just kind of came into being. Well, I mean, of course, he was rolling these ideas around in his head for 9 months, but it came into being so quickly and seemingly so effortlessly. So we all know this house that sort of rests on top of the waterfall this way, with these sort of prominent balconies that kind of cantilever out, seemingly hover weightless in space above the waterfall itself. And then we have these kind of this kind of natural stone foundation. So it looks like it's like this ancient structure that was always there with these kind of modern elements that are kind of sticking out of it. So let's move inside. And I think particularly for anyone who hasn't been inside Falling Water, I think the images of the inside of this house can knock your socks off. They stayed with me. I still remember when I first saw pictures of the inside when I was in college, and it knocked my socks off. Frank Lloyd Wright always loves the fireplace. And here we have, I think, the most distinctive hearth I've ever seen. So we have the natural stone outcropping here that's coming out into your space. Of course, it's a horrible trip hazard, but it's beautiful. It lures you in. And then it feels like, you know, it's natural, it's eternal, it's always been there. And then it's mixed with these kind of red steel elements, including this cauldron that kind of folds into the wall and can come back around into the fire. And you can actually, you know, cook a stew over your fire at your weekend house here. All of this is a part of this sort of grander space, this wide open space, which would be the equivalent of your living room when you were at your weekend house here. So when you're in this room, you are up over the waterfall. You can go out onto balconies and you can hear it. You can sort of peek over the edge of the balcony and see it. But you notice that the furniture here is very low. And most of Frank Lloyd Wright's furniture is very low. It's sort of like an Adirondack chair. It's designed for you to sit down and not get up again. These are not the types of furniture where you are constantly popping up and you know, waiting on other people. Frank Lloyd Wright also loved his clients to use natural animal skins to kind of throw around on his furniture. And then we see a lot of these natural kind of autumnal colors integrated in the space here. But the element of this home that I never forget is just to the left in this image here. So imagine we're walking around the corner, and what you see as you come around this corner is this kind of glass and steel box. And incredibly, this box is a staircase that opens up right there in the living room. You can push the glass back and you head down a set of stairs right into the river underneath the house. And you, as the owner or as the guest, you can sit there and kind of dangle your feet in the water, or you can jump off this platform here, but you have this very intimate experience with the water that's right underneath the house. And I think of Frank Lloyd Wright designing this element here, which I just so love. And he's sort of saying that hearing and feeling the water may be just as good as looking at it from a couple hundred yards away, because certainly his clients in this case were a little surprised that he would design a house that didn't include the gorgeous view. So instead, Frank Lloyd Wright has given them the opportunity to really live with the water in an incredible way. So this was 1935. He's already sort of innovating at this point, and a much later, but still highly recognizable structure that he builds is the Guggenheim Museum, about 25 years later. So we've gone from rural Pennsylvania to the wilds of New York City. And the Guggenheim Museum is, of course, a museum of modern and contemporary art. It was finished in 1959 and opened just a few months after Wright's death. But what we're seeing is a totally different building type too. We've gone from domestic architecture here to museum architecture. And in this case, this was essentially unlike any museum that had ever been built before. And I think there's still room for plenty of debate as to whether or not a structure like this even makes sense for exhibiting works of art. So I'm assuming many of you have probably been inside this building. I love this image here because it gives us a good sense of the scale. We see these tiny people on the sidewalk out in front. So we know that this is a multi-story building, but it's a midget compared to the skyscrapers that surround it. So let's head inside. If you remember, the inside of the Guggenheim Museum is essentially a spiral, and it's flooded with all of this natural light that you can see from a giant round skylight at the top of the building here. And Frank Lloyd Wright had a very specific idea in terms of how you would experience this building and how you would experience the artwork inside of it. And it's probably the opposite of the way that you've actually experienced this building. So I'm sure if you're anything like me, you've walked in before and you found this little ramp right here after you've paid your admission, and you start walking up this ramp, spiraling up to the top. And probably by the time you hit the fourth or fifth floor there, you're just exhausted, your legs are tired. Just being on your feet for a long time can be tiring. And Frank Lloyd Wright has seemed to make it even harder. Well, his idea was that everybody should come in and take the elevator from the top and sort of work your way down. And sort of start off with these views and sort of, meander down, but also have, a little bit of momentum as you move down. So he was really thinking about conserving your energy. And of course, most people aren't experiencing it that way these days. So we've got this round space, and it's an unusual way to exhibit artwork, that's for sure. I'm sure if you were to quiz every curator on the face of the planet and ask them, do round walls make sense for exhibiting artwork, they would say absolutely not. You can also see from this image here that there are these very sort of discrete defined niches throughout the building too. So that sort of limits the size of the works that you can exhibit. And it certainly limits the way these works might be able to speak to each other, but it opens up all this opportunity for how they might relate to each other from maybe across the spiral. So it's definitely a building with a lot of challenges built right into it, but it also kind of set the stage for a lot of other innovative architects. You wouldn't have Frank Gehry designing his really sort of wild contemporary museum designs that he's doing these days without Frank Lloyd Wright doing the Guggenheim first. So that's going to take us to building designs. But if anybody has a burning question at this point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Nothing burning so far. Okay. All right. So let's talk about these house types and what we have up here in Manchester, New Hampshire. So very quickly, we've got these three different house types. And at the top of the screen here, you see an example of the prairie style. And this is probably sort of the most recognizable Frank Lloyd Wright style, and probably the one he's sort of most closely associated with and most famous for. This is the Ward Willett's house in Highland Park, Illinois. So not too far from Oak Park where he was working. Prairie style sort of marks the beginning of his career. And you can identify it by these sort of long, low lines. Think of the flat prairie, of course, these deep overhanging eaves. And prairie style houses tend to be sort of palatial in scale. Even the house that we're looking at here has its own porte cochere. So you get a sense of real elegance looking at a house like this. But it does have some of these Frank Lloyd Wright sort of idiosyncrasies right off the bat here, because when you look at the Ward Willett's house, you don't necessarily see a front door, right? There's kind of an outdoor patio here. There's these kind of glimpses in and through the house, but you don't necessarily get this warm welcome. We think of American domestic architecture before this. It's about, the front porch. It's about a prominent front door. It's really about these kind of social interactions that you're supposed to have that are facilitated by your house. And Frank Lloyd Wright kind of skews that for something that's a little bit more private. So that brings us to his next house type, which was probably the house type that he built the fewest number of. It's sort of associated with a shorter period of his career. The structure that we have here in the lower left is the Ennis House from 1923. This house, believe it or not, has been featured in, I think, more than a dozen different movies, including the original Blade Runner. It's concrete. It's made of these precast concrete blocks. These California houses, or these concrete cast block houses, they tend to look sort of like temples, and Frank Lloyd Wright liked to refer to these blocks as textile blocks. So he was really interested in kind of the pattern and the experience of these houses. But we're going to focus primarily on this house and the style of house that we see down below on the right. And this he called the Usonian house. And for Frank Lloyd Wright, Usonian was simply a synonym for American. He thought it was just another way, a better way to say American. So as he's coming up with the design for Falling Water in the 1930s, he is thinking about, how do I, a rich man's architect, continue to survive? And he came upon this idea that, I need to build a house for America's middle class, something that is affordable and sort of smaller scale, but still really beautiful. So we're looking at what's generally thought of as the first Usonian house. It's the Jacobs House in Madison, Wisconsin. He began the designs for it in 1936, so just a year after Falling Water. And it's about 1,500 square feet, and it only cost about $5,000. If you translated that to today's money, that would be about $88,000. So, still pretty affordable. And it was always supposed to be a modest house. And so let's see how Frank Lloyd Wright makes it a modest house. Certainly from the street, it looks very small scale, right? And we see that he's still using natural materials. He's not really interested in using materials that you would have to paint or stucco or maintain in any real way. So we've got our brick and our wood. We've got a carport instead of a garage. And again, this kind of hidden, mysterious front door and a real sense of privacy here. We see just a little bit of glass, and maybe there's some underneath the overhanging eaves here, but we certainly don't get a sense of a warm welcome from this house. Now, I should tell you that between 1936 and 1959, when Wright died, he designed about 310 Usonian homes, a total of which about 140 were actually built. And they were designed for clients all across the country. The houses that were designed for clients post-war, so after 1945, they tended to be a little bit bigger and have a few more luxuries in them. And the Zimmerman house, which we'll see, certainly falls into that category. And what I can tell you about this is that the clients loved these houses. 35 years after they were built, about 50% of all the clients were still living in their homes. So these were homes that were sort of designed for people to grow old in too, which is really wonderful. So what's so great about this house? Well, let's take a look at it from the backyard. So we've gone from total privacy to essentially a house that looks like it's all glass. And it's really designed to emphasize and to maximize the homeowner's connection with nature and the outdoors. So if you have a lovely backyard, I mean, really your house is completely oriented towards it. A lot of the Usonian houses were designed in sort of an L shape, which you can see here. So there's sort of this main living space, which is on one side, and then the other part of that L would be the bedroom spaces. And when you go inside, again, it's sort of intimate in scale, but Frank Lloyd Wright would always give you a nice big living space. And so sometimes he sort of prescribed the furniture that would go in here. This isn't original Frank Lloyd Wright furniture that we're looking at, but this is the Jacobs house. And he was really concerned with designing things in great proportion. And we'll look at that more closely as we get to the Zimmerman house too. So, but it feels like a good sized room. You don't feel claustrophobic in this house, even though it's designed, the house itself is designed on a smaller scale. So let's shift gears and look at what is up here in Manchester, New Hampshire. So this is the Isidore and Lucille Zimmerman house. This was designed in 1950 and it was completed in 1952. This is a really dramatic angle of the house, but it's also an angle that the homeowners probably didn't get that often because this is sort of standing at a straight, it's standing far away from your own driveway, sort of across the lawn from your house. So let me introduce you to the homeowners and how they arrived at this sort of strange house, which the locals in the neighborhood kind of referred to as a chicken coop when it was first built. So the Zimmermans were not from Manchester originally. He was from New York City originally. She was from Kentucky, but they moved here. He was a doctor. She was his surgical nurse. And they were living in a traditional sort of colonial style home that had 13 rooms in it. And when they hit their mid-40s and they didn't have any children, they began to sense that this house was just not working for them. And they started researching architecture at the local library, and they found a book by Wright that outlined his philosophies. Believe it or not, it didn't have a single picture of any of his buildings. And just based on his philosophies, they wrote him a letter, and they were invited to go out and visit him at his home in Wisconsin, Taliesin. And they wrote to him, "We wish to build a small, simple house that would require the least possible housekeeping," I love them for that, "and which would allow for privacy and outdoor living." In many ways, the Zimmermans were the perfect clients. They were eager to work with Frank Lloyd Wright, and they were very willing to subscribe to his philosophy of how they should live in this house. They actually wrote to him, "We are willing to make all of the necessary financial sacrifices to make this the most comfortable and convenient home for us, as it promises to be the most beautiful." I mean, they sound like very pleasant people to work with, absolutely. So here are, here's a photograph of workmen at the site, and then we have Frank Lloyd Wright and his architectural students, and the young man at the bottom is named John Geiger. So he was one of the members of the Taliesin Fellowship who Frank Lloyd Wright sent out to Manchester, New Hampshire to kind of oversee the construction of the house. Frank Lloyd Wright actually never came to Manchester, New Hampshire, which I think caused Mrs. Zimmerman in particular a great deal of sadness, but he once wrote to her, "Oh, you know, Mrs. Zimmerman, I know your house from A to Z." So he had really studied the plot design for the house, and he had a good sense of what existed there and how the house would relate to nature. So here is what the house looked like shortly after it was built. And if you go there today, the landscape looks really different. It has, it's really sort of grown up. It's gotten a lot more lush. Unfortunately, a lot of those white birch trees are no longer there. You can just see at the front door here, they're Dalmatian. And we see that the house also has a carport like the Jacobs house that we saw. And it's designed in such a way that sort of the rear end of the car always kind of hangs out. So, so now I'm going to go into realtor mode for a moment. So the numbers of the house, the logistics of the house here. So the Zimmerman house is about 1,800 square feet. So just under the size of, you know, the average home today, maybe the size of a good sized condo. It had 2 beds, it has 2 beds, 2 baths, and Wright designed everything, including the interior furnishings, the grounds, even the mailbox. And the original price quoted for that was $36,000, which would have included Wright's 10% too. Not too shabby. In the end, it came out closer to about $60,000. And that still sounds good, but just to give you a sense of comparison here, the average price of a home in Manchester at about that time was $19,000. So in today's money, that $60,000 would have been well over $500,000. And what did they get for that money? And actually, when they wrote him the check, they wrote him a letter and they said, "We've never been so happy to write a check in our entire lives." They were so pleased with this house. So what did the money get them? No basement, no attic, no garage. think about all the things in your basement and attic and garage. Frank Lloyd Wright was saying, you don't need it. You can live without it. So in order to live in one of these houses, you really had to subscribe to kind of a certain minimalist lifestyle. And as I mentioned before, the houses that he designed for clients after World War II tend to be sort of nicer examples of the Usonian design. And this, the Zimmerman house, is really a jewel box of Usonian architecture, because you have upper class clients who essentially were ready to dedicate their lives to this house. This was essentially their baby. And when they passed away, they willed the home and all of its contents to the Currier Museum of Art. And so it's been immaculately preserved since then. So as I said, I've traveled all over the country. I've gone to all these different Wright sites, and I have to say the Zimmerman house stands out so far ahead of the way most Wright houses and buildings have been preserved. This is an incredible example of his work. It's not on the heroic scale of Falling Water, but this is gorgeous. So we're going to go inside just to give us sort of the drone view of the Zimmerman house. You can see that it's diagonally set in its plot, in its sort of square plot here. So you have a triangular front yard and a triangular backyard, and its siting here just happens to take advantage of passive solar energy. We don't really know if Frank Lloyd Wright was really interested in that, but it worked out very well. And it also, by sort of slicing the property in half this way, it does allow for that privacy in the outdoor living that the Zimmermans were so interested in. So here, in a very early photograph right after the house was built, we see the Frank Lloyd Wright designed mailbox, and you'd see how you'd sort of come up the driveway kind of around this bend up to your carport. Here's that mailbox. And the mailbox is sort of gives you a preview of the house. It's all the same materials. We've got concrete, wood, brick, and some glass. Wouldn't you just love to get your mail every day if your mailbox looked like this? So I'm going to make a very big deal out of what is probably the least remarkable feature of the house, and that is the carport. So imagine you're coming home and you're driving up to this space. And what Frank Lloyd Wright has designed here is the opportunity for you to have a panoramic view of nature, just beautifully framed as you come home. And it sets the stage for your experience inside your house. Think for a moment, what do you see when you drive up to your house? Do you drive into a garage that's filled with junk that you don't really need? Do you drive, at my house, you drive up and there's like an old shed that's filled with junk? But here, he's giving you this incredible view. And I've been there on snowy days and on rainy days, and it's always a little bit different, but it is always gorgeous. So this carport, it sets the stage. And there's all sorts of things that related to these grids and functions of the house that are also there, but we'll get into that as we get into the house. So here's just another view through that carport. And this was a design that John Geiger.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
In the previous photo, there was something that, like those benches, are those benches?
Yes, and those are just added because of the tour program now. So those wouldn't.
Oh, okay, because I was curious and see.
Good question.
You wouldn't exactly be seeing the view if you sat there. So.
Oh yeah, I know. Well, you'd think they would. They loved their backyard, but I would highly recommend spending a little bit of time in that carport too.
What's the question relative to the carport is the fact that you mentioned that the trunk was always sticking out, which is not very practical in Manchester, New Hampshire, with all the snow. So you want to get out in the morning in a snowstorm and you've got the covered rear of your car. But they loved it, I guess. Sorry.
Loved it. And there's a lot of things about Frank Lloyd Wright houses in general, and this house in particular, that don't make great sense, that didn't work out functionally. Frank Lloyd Wright once said, take care of the luxuries and the necessities will take care of themselves. So, so he was really operating in a sphere, obviously, where other people were taking care of the necessities. So he was focused on creating, you know, a certain experience or a certain design that I think would work best, maybe in his mind, and maybe not always in the real world. But I appreciate that you pointed that out, because that's a very good point. I mean, it doesn't make sense in Manchester at all. There's a lot about the house that falls in line with that too. So moving inside, coming around the carport, we're oriented now towards the front door of the house. And I just wanted to point out, so here's that front door. Here's the door from the side view here. It's a little bit tough to see, but there's a mitered glass corner there. So it's just, it almost looks like floating glass. It's just two panes of glass fused together with aquarium glue, which sort of allows for a more expansive view from inside. We see these cast concrete block windows, which line the front of the house and give it that incredible sense of privacy. We see the low overhanging eaves, which create that shade. So from the front, the house doesn't necessarily look warm or inviting. But we also see this huge boulder right here by the front door. And Frank Lloyd Wright was very aware that it was there, and he wanted it to be right by the front door. So it's certainly no waterfall, but it's a big sort of organic or natural element that really helps to site the house within the landscape here. I won't spend too much time with the plan here, which I have turned upside down. So all of the text inside is turned around, but I just wanted to keep it oriented with our experience. So we would drive up into the carport, we'd walk over here to the front door, that big boulder would be right here. And then we'd walk down a narrow entryway into what Frank Lloyd Wright called the garden room. It would have been like the living room. And it's by far the biggest room in the house. And Frank Lloyd Wright thought that's where you should be spending all of your time. So let's head into the garden room here. And I have a couple of different views of it too. So the garden room is a garden room, but it's also a music room. So we see the cello over here. Mrs. Zimmerman played a little bit of cello. Dr. Zimmerman played the violin, and they have a grand piano back there. And one of the things that my eye has always gone to when it comes to this room is this very long bench, which has that very high back. It almost reminds me of those dining room chairs that we saw before. And it goes on for something like 28 feet. It just goes on and on and on. And so those benches line you up to look at the windows on the other side here. Let me back up here. So this is what those benches are facing. These incredible windows that, let me just take you through the experience of these windows, because I've really never seen anything else like them. At the bottom here, we have a planter, a garden planter that is inside the house. And then it's just separated by a pane of glass to a garden planter that's on the exterior of the house. So he's literally blending nature from inside to outside. And then just above that, we have this big square window, which is literally acting as a frame for nature here. So you don't need a lot of artwork in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. He's saying that the outdoors is what you should be focusing on here. Then just above that is another pane of glass, which seems to sort of seamlessly separate the indoors and the outdoors. So there's that pane of glass. Frank Lloyd Wright has even designed this like wonderful lighting, which almost looks like he's trying to recreate the experience of sunlight coming down through the trees. But that experience from interior to exterior is supposed to be as seamless as possible. So throughout this space, let me just back up really quick. We have that sense of these huge squares. So from the window to these cushions on the back of the bench here. And if you have really good eyes, you can probably see that the floor has some lines here too. And the floor actually has a grid on it of 4 feet by 4 feet. And so that dimension there is really important throughout the house. So even these cast concrete blocks just above those cushions are 2 feet by 2 feet. The pane of glass within them is 1 foot by 1 foot. So we have this sense that that with this repetition of proportions, you have this kind of elegance to the space that we can just enjoy. You don't even have to decode it. It's just something that makes the experience of the space more enjoyable. So there's all sorts of things I could tell you about this space in particular. It was really designed for the experience of music. It has beautiful acoustics. The music stand here, all of the furniture, but the music stand is this rare and wonderful piece in the house. The Zimmerman saw it when they went to Taliesin, and I think it's one of only about 5 in the world. Here's another view looking back through the garden room. We see that entryway that we came down through here before, and we see the very prominent fireplace that we know Frank Lloyd Wright loves so much. So gone is the nice little Roman arch here, and instead we have this very modern take on a fireplace. And Frank Lloyd Wright is really playing with us architecturally here, because we have a broken lintel at the top here with a seam right there. And of course, it's unsupported. It looks like this big, heavy masonry here is just hanging here unsupported. Looks like it could fall down at any second. And then look at this historic photograph. Lucille Zimmerman liked to sit right underneath that. It's almost like tempting fate, right? I'm gonna sit under a couple tons of brick here and just make sure it doesn't fall. Dr. Zimmerman over here reading, and their book, I'm sorry, their dog, their Dalmatian, coming through the space. So now we're going to move into their dining room, which is just to the right of where Mrs. Zimmerman is sitting here. And this is probably the most anticlimactic dining room ever, but you spend a moment or two in here and you realize that it's brilliant. So Frank Lloyd Wright called this the dining loggia, because you can see on the right, it's all these glass doors which open up to screens. So you can literally just, it's like eating outside for as much of the year as you would like to do this. But look at this dining area. It's 2 seats and maybe a hassock. But think of the dining room in most traditional American homes. How often is it used? What's it used for? If it's like my house, it's just a place to throw your mail down. And Frank Lloyd Wright knew that this was a house for 2 people, and so he created this really intimate space. This is where we can also see his other grid at work. In addition to the 4 feet by 4 foot grid that you see on the floor, he had a vertical grid of 13 inches, which was equal to about 5 courses of brick and mortar. So, all of the chairs were about 13 inches off of the ground. All of the tables were about double that. And then the shelves were about 13 inches from each other. And again, so on this wall, you can see it here too, and on the wall just behind it. So all of the furniture you were able to kind of mix and match it. You could bring it into any room and it would be the appropriate height. And it just created this sense of harmony throughout the house that really made it a pleasant place to be. The other thing that I so love about this dining room is that you can't see dirty dishes when you're sitting there. You have to go around this corner. Oh, I should say too. So in terms of mixing and matching, you could bring a lot of people back into that garden room. You could even bring your dining room table. And I think that they had up to 12 people for dinner sitting along this bench with chairs and hassocks. But you could really entertain here, but everyday functionality was more geared towards the intimate. So I just loved that everything could kind of work together there. Going back through the dining loggia, you can see there's some white appliances back there. This is the tiny little galley kitchen, or what Frank Lloyd Wright called the workspace, because it was also the laundry room. There's no dining room here either. It's at the very center of the house. Frank Lloyd Wright popped up the ceiling here so you could have a clerestory light coming in. You could also open those windows, so as you're cooking, all of the heat and the smells could just go right out of the house. Looking back through the workspace here, we can appreciate that there's open shelving. You can just kind of grab your pots and pans. It's really designed to be kind of an easy space to work in. And then we're just going to run over to the guest room. The guest room is really separated from the rest of the house, and it is this kind of wonderful private space. It's got its own bathroom. We can see that there are 2 twin beds in here. You can rearrange the position of the beds. This part of the house is actually kind of built into the ground. So just outside of this window right here, We can see it over here on the left. We've got another mitered glass corner, and you're actually at ground level. So there's this real wonderful sense of safety and security there. And we have a little desk that also doubled as Mrs. Zimmerman's sewing table. And again, you know, all of the chairs here could be mixed and matched, brought in, brought out. And then just with very limited time, he designed great closets for them. That was like the one thing that the Zimmermans kind of fought for in this house, was better storage, and they got it. And their master bedroom, here with kind of a funky angle on the picture, is here. And so we still have that concrete floor with the 4x4 grid on the ground. We've got a tiny double bed here, but the real star of this room is the ceiling. So you've got this wooden ceiling. Frank Lloyd Wright sort of thought, you know, most people put wood on, you know, hardwood floors on the ground, and you're not really appreciating the wood grain or the beauty of this wood. So he created this beautiful ceiling for them, and again, these incredible windows where that transition from indoor to outdoor just blends right in. And imagine lying down in that bed and seeing, you know, this beautiful wood that just takes your eye right out to this gorgeous backyard. A little built-in desk here, but for the most part, this was really just a room designed for sleeping. Here's just another view of that ceiling there, so beautiful. And then here's that same master bedroom from the back of the house. And the back of the house, like the Jacobs house before, is really sort of the most beautiful spot. This is where we see that the entire back of the house is almost glass, and it's really designed for that privacy and that outdoor living. This is sort of at the point of that triangle that is their backyard. The Zimmermans also commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright's son-in-law, who was working with him, to create this little monument at the back of their property. And I know it's hard to see here, but it says, "Beautify your own life and you beautify the lives of those around you." And that's really what they were trying to do. They knew that this house would be their legacy, and they took such good care of it, knowing that they wanted people to enjoy it for years to come. So I know that we're just at about an hour here, so I just wanted to very quickly show you the surprise, and that is the other Frank Lloyd Wright house on the same street. So this house has only recently become open to the public, and then of course COVID hit, so I think there's been very few people that have gone through this house. When I was working at the Courier, it was for sale at that time for about $2 million. The price had continually come down. It was consistently owned by the Khalil family, and I think the Courier ended up purchasing it for about $800,000 or $900,000. So obviously a dramatically different design here. This house was built only a few years later, 1955. It's 3 lots down from the Zimmerman's house. It's smaller than the Zimmerman house, believe it or not. It's under 1,400 square feet. And it's 2 beds, 2 baths. And there's actually an unfinished in-law house on the property too. So this was designed designed for Dr. Tufik Khalil, who was a colleague of Dr. Zimmerman's. And Frank Lloyd Wright referred to this style of house as Usonian automatic, which is such a great name, because what he intended to convey was the automatic part meant that you built it yourself. So this is a modular concrete block home. Just comes together automatically when you built it. So the Khalils built this house, and I think it's so wonderful that this is a back view of that same property, that they got such a different house than the Zimmermans. So, and of course, when it's all lit up inside, it does look, I mean, I think a lot of people initially look at it and they think bunker, but when it has this glowing light from inside, it really is something special. Here's that in-law apartment that's also on the property. The property is about 3/4 of an acre. And then inside, the Khalil family has done a great job in trying to preserve those original furnishings too that were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So we see a lot of the same ideas here. We see the grid on the floor. There was a carport outside. We see furnishings that look very similar to what the what the Zimmermans had. We see a tiny little dining room over here. And as we walk around the corner, we can see the doorway out to the patio. And then again, around that corner, here's the dining room again, and the kitchen. Frank Lloyd Wright loved red. It was sort of his signature color, so you tend to see a lot of it in his houses. So like I said before, there are 2 bedrooms. Here's the first one. It sort of reminds me of the Zimmerman's master bedroom. You've got a little desk here. I believe this is all mahogany inside the Khalil house the Zimmermans had, Upland, Georgia cypress. Are you ready for the master bedroom? Are you ready to move in, right? I think the master bedroom might change your mind. Who wants to spend the night there? This one doesn't really welcome you quite the same way. So this gives us a sense of Frank Lloyd Wright's take on the Usonian house and the Usonian automatic. So let's just wrap up with thinking about Wright today and sort of his legacy, how we think of him. So in terms of public sites, we sort of have a silver lining in COVID-19 because you can now virtually tour over 20 public Frank Lloyd Wright sites. And even if you were to just Google that, you could find all of those links very easily on one website. There are also 72 public Frank Lloyd Wright sites now that you can visit or will be able to visit when the pandemic ends. And that does include 18 different sites where you can actually spend the night too. But that's really only if you care to, challenge your body with the right designed furniture. As of May 2020, there were 5 Wright properties for sale. The cheapest one was actually under $200,000. The most expensive one was for about 10 million. And certainly being the owner of a Wright designed home is a labor of love. You have to sort of be committed to preserving it. I don't even know offhand how much the Courier has put into preserving the Zimmerman house, but I do know that when they redid the roof, I think that was close to about $100,000. So there is a theory out there that Frank Lloyd Wright didn't really design his houses to outlive his clients. So really you're working against time and materials when you take on ownership of one of these houses. We also have a real interest in Frank Lloyd Wright as a person. So certainly he was featured in Devil in the White City and books like Loving Frank. So we have this kind of renewed interest in him, not only as an architect, but for this dramatic life that he led. And then in terms of his legacy, that's sort of something that's kind of up for question now, because you have the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, which has always been committed to kind of preserving his legacy. They've recently severed ties with the School of Architecture at Taliesin. And there's been all this reporting recently too about sort of a toxic internal culture there. So his legacy, I think is very strong, just because I think all of these people are so interested in him as a person and his architectural output. So I think he continues to fascinate. And I think, even 50 years from now, his buildings will have this kind of, this quality that kind of draws us all in and inspires a sense of awe. So I hope you got a sense of that tonight as we were looking at these images. And I want to thank you again for joining us and for your attention. And I welcome any questions you might have.
Just a quick question. Did you not say the Zimmermans were from New York? So how did they end up in Manchester?
I think
little biograph, any little more embellishment of that that you have to offer.
I'm trying to remember. I think essentially they both ended up here. Dr. Zimmerman was from New York originally. I think they both ended up here as because they were both training for medical careers, and I believe it was Mrs. Zimmerman that was working at the Concord Hospital at one point, but eventually their careers led them up to New Hampshire. That's a great question.
Thank you.
I missed the introduction, so I'm not. Maybe you already said this, but is the Zimmerman house closed then right now? It's not open for tours?
I believe it is closed now, and I can imagine that they would be really careful with reopening it just because it is such an intimate space. They would typically have about 12 to 14 people on a tour. And so for a house that's 1,800 square feet, you can imagine that that can be kind of tight. That would be like any of us probably having 15 or so people in our house. So I think I'm sure that they're going to be cautious with the reopening.
Hi, Jane. That's another wonderful presentation. I was just curious. It seems like he spent so much time on focusing on the view and enjoying nature and the beauty of everything, but it didn't look like he provided a comfortable area for seating to enjoy the view. Do you know if any of his furniture is comfortable at all?
I haven't had the opportunity to sit in a lot of his furniture. I have sat in some of them, and it was okay. But I think I think we can just see, even looking at them, that they don't seem like they are designed to be comfortable. So if I go back, and I don't know how quickly I can get us back to the right image here. There are two sort of armchairs in that garden room that were not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. These two kind of golden chairs over here. They were designed in a style that Frank Lloyd Wright really liked, and the Zimmermans were really careful in their purchase of it. And from what I understand, they spent a lot of time in those two chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other quick question. You mentioned he designed the furniture, the mailbox, etc. Did he do any designing on the landscape?
Yes, to a limited degree. And I think for the landscape, he made a lot of recommendations in terms of their plantings and sort of how they could maintain that property. But I don't think he made major changes to the landscape. I think he wanted to design a house that really fit into what was already there. That's a good question. I do see a chat from my sister-in-law, who's a musician, and she has played inside this room, and she's reminding me of a great sort of musical connection in this garden room here. So the Courier oftentimes gives these kind of special twilight tours that feature music, live music in the house. And so my sister-in-law is reminding me of the musical connection here with the grid, in that with these cushions being about 4 feet by 4 feet and the concrete blocks being 2 feet by 2 feet, pane of glass 1 foot by 1 foot, there was the connection there of like the whole note, the half note, the quarter note. So you can almost understand the whole thing as being kind of a musical composition coming together. I'm so glad she reminded me of that. I always think with the wooden ceiling there too, you almost feel like you're inside a musical instrument. Any other questions?
I was struck by his first residence that you showed at the beginning of the presentation, that it was, obviously something for someone of means. Was Wright so well known already in his career at that point that he could afford that, or did he come from money?
That's a really good question. I think of him as coming from sort of humble beginnings. And I do know that sort of early on in his career in Chicago, he kind of butted heads with his mentor, Louis Sullivan, because he began kind of moonlighting as an architect for rich people sort of before his formal apprenticeship was done. So I think he secured a couple of significant clients very early on. And I think, like I said, he was a man who would dedicate himself to the luxuries. So he wasn't afraid to leverage his finances or to go into debt to create exactly the kind of structure that he would want.
Okay, thank you.
Trying to catch up on the chats here too.
Was there anything special done to stop the windows from having condensation?
Oh, that's a really good question. Offhand, I don't recall offhand, and I'm trying to recall if there ever was condensation. I think the large panes of glass in the garden room, you could see there would be some condensation at certain times of the year, but I'm not sure if there was anything, if it was specially treated in any certain way to prevent that.
I think in the Gropius house, he had to like put in some sort of ventilation right next to the windows to stop it from icing up.
I don't recall offhand if they ever had to do something like that, but that's a really good question. I think New Englanders look at these windows and they just all the challenges there, right?
Are they all single glazed, or they're not insulated glass?
It is single glaze. But again, it does really work with passive solar energy, and then you've got a concrete floor here. So in the winter, it's like the sun comes right through, it heats up the floor really well. But like I said, these houses are really hard to maintain. So there was radiant floor heating here, forced hot water through pipes underneath that concrete floor. And sometime after the Zimmermans moved in, that radiant floor heating did fail. So they installed a forced hot air system. And when the courier inherited the house, they actually removed all of the contents and jackhammered the floor and reinstalled radiant floor heating, which is pretty amazing. I do have a few images of that as well. Sorry to go through this all so quickly. So with the restoration, I mean, they had to very carefully take out all of these built-in elements for the house that were never designed or intended to ever leave the house. In the master bedroom, the double bed couldn't fit out through the door, so they actually had to suspend it from the ceiling for several months as they jackhammered the floor. They were moving appliances and doors like this into neighbors' houses, believe it or not. And they took out sort of the best of the best, and they had an exhibition at the Courier which exhibited his interior design work. There were bubble wrapping shelves hanging up all this plastic, and then they had to jackhammer the floors. And you can see here, so this is what the room looked like, and then you can see here on the left, this is what the pipes looked like that had corroded. The contractors actually hadn't used the right material that Frank Lloyd Wright had suggested, and then the Courier laid in all of this neoprene tubing for the radiant floor heating, which you can see on the right. And sadly, that has failed as well. And then they had to pour out a new concrete floor and score in those same grid lines and get like just the right color. So the amount of time and work and dedication and money that has been put into this house is really incredible. And this is curators restoring some of the brass fixtures in the house. There's over 700 brass fixtures. So all of it was taken off, all of it was cleaned and restored and then put back together. So the house is a little bit of a jigsaw, but like I said, it's been lovingly restored, and it's really just a shining example of what Frank Lloyd Wright was capable of. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your evening with me. And I'm sure that I'll be working with the Chelmsford Library very soon, and I hope to see you again soon.